welcome to Zara Chowdhary. Thank you for coming to talk to us about your memoir, The Lucky Ones. It chronicles a 16-year-old Zara going through the 2002 anti-Muslim pogrom in Gujarat. Why would people want to read this? But more
Right.
importantly, why do you want to write it? Tell me about that impulse more than 20 years after.
I've always been a writer in many different forms. And so even when I worked in advertising, writing copy, or when I was in a film studio trying to, work on a film, there was always this weird impulse to want to write this and say something about this reality too, that this is also India, and not just the ones in which, you're selling Godrej locks or Pepsi or whatever it is,
Mhm.
or dreams and this sort of like escapist India that you want everybody to be in. And in that world, I just always felt ridiculous trying to remind people of this reality. And I felt like such an anomaly, and that somehow this would draw attention to the fact that I was an anomaly and that I didn't have the same kind of hunky-dory majoritarian growing up in, this lovely India where everything and everybody just gets along. And that was not my story. I've always shrunk away from that kind of investigation of myself or that kind of spotlight. So even when I used to sort of push it in there and maybe have like this Muslim character in the background, yeah, somebody who knew somebody, jo, bazaar gaye, riot hua, jal gaye, like I would put these things in there and then I would quickly pull it out because I was so scared of reminding myself and others that this had been my reality. And so even when 2014 happened, I remember just having drafts and drafts of just like half written, angry, rantful pieces on my computer, trying to remind people that there are some of us who have seen this person and have seen this reality as our own. And this is now going to become the country's reality. And yet I would always know that there's going to be something that that there's going to be a shirking away from it, that a lot of people are going to read or listen to it and sort of be dismissive. And I think I was so clearly trying to avoid that because that would have brought pain. To be dismissed again after having lived through it was something I didn't want to put myself up for. But it's really in that moment of 2019, 2020, once especially the protest started in India, and I saw this whole generation of younger people, so many of who were like born in the late 90s, who would have probably been in elementary school, like, middle school when 2002 happened. And they
Mhm.
were such brave, incredible, brilliant voices standing up and, reciting fairs and saying all these beautiful things about ekta and secularism and whatever. And when they would talk about 2002, there was this sense of like, this old thing that happened, this thing that maybe happened a long time ago. And it just made me feel again sort of like a sense of association, that I'm living in a reality where this thing happened in a time capsule and nobody seems to draw straight lines from it. And I was already kind of writing about my father in this more sort of personal way, trying to figure for my own self what my relationship with him was, especially in his passing. But that story just seemed to become bigger and bigger and bigger, to realize that my father was the man he was and the parent he was because the state exerted a certain impact on him. And that 2002 was not this anomaly that lives in its own little bubble, but the result of 20, 30 years before that that built up to it. And that 2019, 2020 was then the result of many things that built up after 2002, right? So just placing something back in that continuum of history became very important.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you then, having had that impulse and then the pandemic hits, what was your process of unearthing the memories from,
Mm,
20 years ago? Like what do you gain from 20 years of hindsight and wisdom, but also what
mm,
do you lose?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much that you, especially, I think memory anyway plays a lot of strange magical tricks on all of us. But especially when you're dealing with trauma, and especially trauma that comes from fear and fear of state, fear of repression, it's constant, sort of like, a room full of mirages. You're just kind of trying to remember if, did I get this right? And you're second guessing yourself, and you're also gaslighting yourself at times into, believing certain things. It really helped me that there's been such brave journalism about Gujarat over the decades that still exists. And so I was able to really ground myself in some of that. But also voices, right? Like the testimonies of whether it is Nishreen Jaffrey or Tista or like any of these people who have over and over and over again put themselves out in the public spaces and spoken with such courage, but also such tenderness. That became like a raft that I constantly kind of held on to as I was writing. But on the personal front, for me, it became this almost beautiful journey in some ways of just sitting with my mother and my sister, who are really the only two sort of surviving people for me from that household that we all grew up in. Um, and for us to also, speak aloud and repeat what we each remembered of a moment. And it was beautiful because then suddenly you have this very prism-like memory and you're seeing it from these three different vantage points, and each thing is illuminating a different part. Um, and then it's not just memory, right? But it's hurt that is also being illuminated in these different ways, because what seemed to me perhaps as a moment of like betrayal seems like a moment of like deep pain for my mother, but feels like something that was just amusing and whatever for my sister. So to interrogate memory in this multi-dimensional way, I think it really helped all three of us to recognize that even within the same household, we had lived such different lives. Um, and that process really felt like the richest gift I gave myself in writing this book, and really sitting down with both of them and going through everything. The question of why was it so hard for us to be loved as daughters within this household? Why was it so hard for my father to love my mother? Why was it so hard and remains so hard for my country to love me? So these were all intertwined, and there was never just one answer that we were getting, and that became the sort of richness that led to the writing.
Wow, that sounds like a very like cathartic process that also, led to like a kind of co-creation. I know
But
that your background is also specifically in script writing. That was the
yes.
first MFA that you did. Did you think of this as a screenplay in any way, or how was the prose different?
That's such a great question, because it's not, I didn't think of it as screenplay, but I certainly, my brain, I think, is trained to think in cinematic ways. So for me, when I look at what needs to be conveyed, I'm always thinking of the establishing shot and then the mid and then the close. And then I'm thinking about what information do you pack in each of those frames, right? So I do think in frames. Which is why it's funny, because even when the book went out for blurbing and Suketu Mehta read it, he wanted to have a call with me, and he spoke to me and he was like, I see this as a film. Like it felt to me like watching, Garam Hawa or like one of those films. Like I felt this sense of just this visual scope. So I just think that's the way I look at story, and the way I look at the world in these frames. And I imagine that's just what I'm doing. I haven't spent that time right now to really interrogate the self and the style and the craft as much. But I know that it's been, just what now, 18, 19 years of really just like honing in many different forms, failing, catastrophically through it all, being taught by so many great masters and teachers in so many ways, that it really helped me draw from so many different things. For me, like the love of Urdu poetry really drove a lot of the ability to allow myself to work in refrain. Like I do a lot of the ghazal sort of refrain in my sentences. There's a lot of a year for dialogue, which for me is a very cinematic way of writing, when you have that sort of sense of, jo adhi adhuri baat sort of dialogue, which is a very specific way of writing. So I find that the germ of my writing is a very kind of rooted Indian way of thinking about story. So for me, it just became that, plus the ethic of why are we writing this book, right? If it was just going to be a tell-all, scandalous, like, look at all the terrible things, like this laundry list of everything shitty that happened in our lives, who is it serving? So if you can sit and really interrogate, like, what is the slightly bigger picture without having any big grandiose ideas of, main dunya badal dungi, but what is it that I can offer to somebody else that is bigger than just my relief and my catharsis?
Yeah, and I mean, this is what I wanted to ask you about, that the book weaves these many different, layers in. From it begins almost with a more macro, like wide
Mm,
shot of the things
mm,
that were happening. You talk about Ehsan Jafri, you talk about
mm,
the known massacres, and then you start to bring in your own world and your life at home. And then also throughout, you're bringing in these aspects of the ancient history of Gujarat that is, as you said, brought it to where it was. And I remember the last part you introduced was the kind of ghettoizing of it.
mm,
It was obviously,
mm,
which is what enabled it to happen the way that it did. So tell me about bringing these different elements together and weaving them
mm.
into the book.
One of the things that became very central to like the scope was I was studying a lot of environmental history at the time that I was actively working in those 4 years that I was actively writing it. And when you think about environmental history, you start to recognize this much bigger sense of time, right? That yes, a pogrom can be 3 days, a pogrom can be 3 months. In the case of how we're looking at the world right now, a genocide can, go on and on and on almost endlessly in front of our eyes, live streamed, and we still don't think about time in this reflexive way. And people seem to fail to see connections between very ancient history, modern or contemporary history, and then the present moment. And something about the incredible work that a lot of environmental historians do is that they make you think about like geological time and how a place and a land came to be, and then what were the different ways that humans have altered those environments to suit themselves, and how have the politics of that environment been shaped, right, by the physicality. And I think when I was working through those courses and a lot of that literature, I started to think about the Sabarmati and the fact that so much of our history, we go on and on about Sabarmati ke Sant and Gandhi's ashram being on the Sabarmati and whatever. And then for me, the Sabarmati was always this dry, arid stretch of land that I saw from my balcony every day, morning and night. I saw the sun reflect in it when it, came up. I saw the sun go down at it every evening. I saw the Eid ka chand over the Sabarmati. For me, the Sabarmati was the living sort of testament every day to our lives in Ahmedabad. I used to watch, kids play cricket on it because there was no water and there's just mud in the flats, and the bears, coming and sitting on the side of it. And then I also remember the big deal that it became, especially in the 2010s and 14 onwards, that, oh, the Sabarmati is this like, full of water, and there's all these incredible promenades, and there's malls, and now apparently there's an aquarium coming up, and it's going to become like Singapore. And to me, the Sabarmati was always where the slums were and where so much of Ahmedabad's poorest lived, including Gulshan, who worked in our household, right? So that change and that transformation became just fascinating. And to think about riots and pogroms then through that, it almost helped me kind of distance myself from the pain of the personal and think about this more in terms of the way that humans so intentionally design a place and a city and a neighborhood and a ghetto to ostracize one group and to create opportunity and access for another.
That's an interesting insight. I hadn't thought of it that way. I guess at the same time as you were weaving in these really big things and then the small in the family, you also ended up leaving out a lot of things in the narrative, like there's not that much about your life in school. So I'm keen to understand, in putting this together, how did you decide which parts of your life at that time you want to exclude and which parts you wanted to be like the core of the story?
I think I'm not that deliberate in choosing and sort of discerning what should go in and shouldn't. I think it's mostly been very instinctive to what feels like it hits the right note and right sort of, when I talk about bhav and ras like that, like it has to hit that note of what it is that the scene is trying to tell. What is the bigger arc of the chapter? What was I trying to say? So, for instance, there's another piece that I usually read at readings and events, which is about when the board exams get postponed, because the big sort of underlying tension amidst all of this, my little petty tension is that I'm in my 10th standard and I have to give my board exams and those get postponed, right? And so that piece, when I read, I've been looking at it over and over again because it starts with the announcement that the board exams are indefinitely postponed for the state and they're suspended and we don't know when it'll happen. And then within the household, you have this cousin and me who are both sort of competing for the same grade or better in our 10th standard.
Hmm.
And then it sort of quickly shifts to this memory of the fact that I was such a, like, when they say like bekar kind of child, that when I was a kid, I didn't even learn how to eat with my hands ever. And I only learned how to eat with a spoon. And so how much I feel inadequate and how much it would mean to me to just get that damn grade in my 10th standard. And I just want to be able to make it past. Um, and so it's like that, I think when you're writing a thing, you can, if you start to really hone in on what feels right on a gut level, then the memory kind of just might show up in a very random place. And it's up to you then as a writer or as a storyteller to see which thread of that is actually anchored in this bigger feeling.
Yeah, and like you said, there were many journalistic accounts of that time, but to my understanding, there's not a lot of first person accounts in
Mm.
this way.
None,
Um,
not in a
uh,
book.
wow. So, what were your inspirations that you looked to while you were writing this? Critics have likened you to Ta-Nehisi Coates or to, in your book itself, you mentioned Anne Frank as like the diary that you looked to and you remembered from your history class.
Yeah, I mean, two of the writers that I really was very just taken by was, I mean, Coates for sure, but also Claudia Rankine, who's written Citizen, an American lyric, because she does this multi-genre way almost of telling one story, which is kind of what this is. It doesn't follow a very linear or even like a one genre kind of path as a book, right? It sort of goes in and out and does a few funky things along the way. But beyond that, I was also, I mean, I've always been very kind of just drawn to, and I've spent a lot of time studying Holocaust literature. So from undergrad, I just very closely sort of studied a lot of the writing that was coming out by survivors of the Holocaust, whether it was in documentary, in specifically in memoir, but also in poetry. And Paul Celan has this, he was an Auschwitz survivor, and he has this incredible poem called Death Fugue, I think. It's the point of view of a Jewish body that is, outside doing the labor in this concentration camp that can only see the officer in his bungalow and is describing the officer in this way. So it's kind of this reverse gaze, right, of looking at the oppressor, almost looking at them with fascination, looking at them with curiosity in a humanity that they won't afford to you. And in studying that sort of literature, I also just found this incredible female written memoir, Ruth Kluger's Still Alive. And she does this thing in the book where she talks about the fact that she and her mother, I think they're in Dachau or they're in Auschwitz, but at some point she finds that her mother is in the same camp as she is. And then how, when, what should be like this Milan kind of moment of mother and daughter finding each other in this desperate, terrible place, suddenly also turns into like tension and dysfunction and a way of recognizing that mothers and daughters also can have complicated relationships in the middle of a Holocaust, right? And that for me was a real moment of finally finding resonance in a story and saying, yes, this is what I needed to get to, because I'm not just telling you the story of look at these perfect, rosy, beautiful Muslim families who were destroyed. I'm telling you, look at these flawed, dysfunctional, complicated, perhaps even unlikable Muslim families. But the fact that they were unlikable does not mean that it was okay to annihilate them. And that sense of why do we need to be so perfect and so blameless for you to fight for us was always the question that my child's mind had been asking. And I think I found the language for it in looking at other people's writing like this.
Wow, and I mean, yeah, that is the power of literature, to create like complex characters that we can still empathize so deeply with. I wanted to ask actually now about your family itself. Like, what was it like creating such, complex portraits of your family, especially your dad? How did you navigate shame with wanting to express the truth of how things were, wanting to get into the messiness? I don't know, like, did you have conflicting thoughts about it along the way?
I accepted at a very young age in life that I'm not a good daughter. And I think that that was very freeing for me to be able to say that aloud to myself. I think so much of what we think of as shame is these labels of good and bad that our society unfortunately like forces all of us to contend with constantly. And the reason I say that I accepted that I'm not a very good daughter is because after a childhood in which, this parental figure had was essentially an authoritarian within the household, and he had this ability to suppress and sort of suck the oxygen out of everything that we wished for and aspired to, right? When he passed away, I remember distinctly, my mother mourning and grieving so profusely, my sister being devastated. And after a few weeks of it, I remember sitting down with both of them and looking at them and saying, but we're free. And how wicked that must be of me to say, but we're free. But I have always, at some level, been that person who saw that both things can exist. The fact that I can feel a certain lightness in my being now, and perhaps also in some way reckoning with the loss and realizing that this was a person who was the central figure of the first half of my life and will always have this sort of deep presence, and his shadow will remain in my brain in this way. And I can live with both parts of my brain. I have to. There's no other way for me to survive but to keep these two parts in conversation, right? So the book was really my attempt to allow for that complexity as a human being, as a daughter, as a woman to exist on the page. That there can be the person that most oppresses you, that you are also allowed to miss, that you are also allowed to eulogize, and you are also allowed to critique in a way that only you have permission to do. There were so many times in the writing of it that I did have that sort of self-doubt of, we're living in an age where the Muslim man is most criminalized right now. And every aspect of, um, like faith-based rules or societal sort of cultural rules are right now being weaponized against us, whether it's like thinking on talaq or hijab or whatever. Every blame comes and lands at the doorstep of the Muslim man and that male body right now. And it is the most endangered, I would say, on the streets of India, right? In that sense. Am I serving that narrative by serving up my father in this story? And I had to remind myself that I cannot be caught up in this moment of madness. If that is the sort of madness of narrative that is out there, we were, and our humanity and our life has always been bigger than that. And in fact, the only way to assert it is to remind ourselves that we are allowed to be flawed in this way. And so, even if he was this person within the household, there were incredibly redeeming qualities about him as a human being. The fact that this man who was not Islamic, he didn't know how to pray. He didn't literally know how to say Arabic, like kalmas or surahs or whatever. He drank profusely, and yet there were some things about him that were so on point, like the fact that if he took his two daughters out for a meal once in several years to treat them to pizza, he would make sure to take the kids from the fourth floor who are orphans because he knew one thing somebody had told him, that Rasulullah loves orphans. And so that was a thing he would always do. Or the fact that he was so mercilessly honest and would not be corrupted, whether it was by bribes in the government office, whether it was corruption through like somebody speaking evil of someone else. So there were these weird contradictions in this man, and I have inherited so many of those. So how am I, if turning away from him is turning away from myself? So it was that I needed to be able to do in the book.
Yeah, and really, that was my favorite aspect of the book. Just how rich and textured that character was. You mentioned the honesty to a fault. I chuckled thinking of the moment in the train that you're talking about, where he just would not let that go and pay that
Yeah.
bribe at all. Or the way you describe how he flew the kite.
Mhm.
Just like really beautiful anecdotes and parts of him to paint the picture of a very
Mm.
complicated person. The next thing I was going to ask you was, how did you avoid the trappings of these tropes?
Mm.
Like it's so easy to get put into the box of this is the Indian story, or this is the brown thing, or this is the woman thing, this is the
Mm.
trauma narrative, or now it's the Muslim woman narrative. How did you
Right.
not get into any of the boxes?
I think what was really helpful a lot is the fact that we are stereotyped so abundantly in this world, whether it is Hollywood, whether it is Bollywood, whether it's Indian television, whether it's our friends, who'll say, Acha Eid hai, biryani kab khila rahe ho? Like there is so much of stereotyping of our identity that it actually becomes very easy then to pull away from it and say, well, but this is actually what feels true to me and my unique experience. And I'm a composite of all of these different identities, and I'm just going to be this and take from it what you may.
I guess I also wanted to know about the title, The Lucky
Mm,
Ones. I obviously like literally took that as among the lucky Muslim families in Gujarat at the
mm,
time survive. Was there any other aspect of the title that you were thinking of? And when you say the lucky ones, is it also
mm.
ironic because it's lucky that you survived, but you also carry that trauma and that guilt or whatever else that comes with it? So tell me about that.
Yeah, thank you for asking, actually. I've had some very awkward silence kind of moments at readings when, somebody who hasn't read the book and doesn't know anything about the event, especially in America, they'll come over and they'll be like, no, no, we are the lucky ones that we got to see you. And I'm like, I don't think you know what the title means. But yeah, it's mainly ironic, obviously, because how do you define luck in a pogrom? Like, how do you define luck in whose house the bomb falls on, whose daughter they find, when the mob is out hunting? How do you use luck and feel better about your survival over another? So it really is questioning and kind of, trying to go in there and like touch that really sore place that is survivor's guilt. But it is also, I mean, one of the big excavations I've been doing my whole adult life, I think, is what is still carrying us? Like the level of othering, the level of feeling cut away, from the main body and being told that you don't belong, that you are not like us, and you are not off here. That is such a constant wound and sort of, breakdown in the psyche that you're living with. So then what is it that keeps us? And I see that happen a lot with Muslim friends, with young Muslim students who I mentor or speak with, or grown adult people who are writers, artists themselves, journalists. There is such a deep sense of just like, moral and like spiritual numbness and emotional numbness in so many Muslims right now. Sometimes I think about why is it that, my sister and I sometimes are able to just like sit and laugh and have these like just ability to look at things from the outside. And I realized it's because we have always been outsiders. Even within our own home, we were not considered on the inside. We were considered as other. My mother used to say this because she's an army officer's daughter, of how, when you are just plucked and moved every 2 years in India to, she born in Kashmir, lived in Kanyakumari, lived in Nagpur, lived in Assam, wherever. Like she's had this nomadic lifestyle where you don't belong to anywhere, and therefore, in a way, you belong to everywhere. And I think that really became our way of, I think she transferred that ability to us, that we lived in a household where we didn't think we were part of it in many ways. And yet it made us want to then sort of attach ourselves to anything and, almost like sort of symbiotic, like vines, just sort of wrap ourselves around trees and grow wherever we were planted. And yet in that, there's such a deep sense of the fact, like I just read, the fact that my dada's Punjabi, my dadi is Gujarati, my nani is Konkan, my nana is, half Tamil, half Telugu. So there is this insane quantity of culture that has been poured into us. And yet, in many ways, each of them is telling us, no, no, you're not fully from us. How is that different from now the Hindu sort of majoritarian state telling us, no, no, you are not from here? So there's a sense of feeling fortunate in some ways, of knowing that everything I need to belong, I carry inside me. No state, no piece of kagas, no nothing is going to tell me that I belong or not.
Speaking of kagas, actually, in the book you talk about leaving from Gujarat. And I don't know if you've ever gone back.
The last thing that I mentioned that I did go in the book is the last time I've been, yeah, in 2012.
And now you live in the US. Tell me about place, like there's Gujarat, there's India in general, then there's the US.
Mm,
Imagine the US, initially meant an escape from all the
mm,
things that India meant to you, place where perhaps you could, I don't know, maybe breathe easier or maybe express yourself better.
mm.
But what's that been like?
I think as I grew, one of the things that I grew closer to was this idea of treading over this planet like the way a wandering like dervish would, or a Baba fakir would, which is very Modi ji's line in a way, jhola utha ke le jayenge. But I think it takes a certain unbelonging. And when it happens that early in life, that you are told that, this is not your permanent place. And I look now at everything in life in this sort of Islamic lens of transience, that I'm here temporarily. Um, and so I take the gifts of wherever I am and whatever kindness people show me. Um, for me, America is the place that allowed me silence, just the silence even inside my mind, so that I could think and write and process and put a book together. I think of Chennai specifically as the place that saved me.
Mm.
Uh, the ocean always as the place that I feel most at home, even though I don't know how to swim. Uh, yeah, I think in those terms. I think in terms of survival, and then even with survival, I try to remind myself that it's a fraud, a scam that this world plays on us, of telling us that we have to survive. We don't have to survive. We just have to spend the time we have here being of some use. So,
Hmm. Thanks. We have a question from
Mhm.
Madhuri in the chat. She says, can you talk a little bit about your choice of memoir as the form to tell your story? Also, how did you overcome the very cultural prohibition
Fiction.
against
Yeah.
speaking about your family with
Mm,
such rawness and honesty? Part of the question is, as opposed to fiction, like a memoir, as opposed to choosing to fictionalize these things,
right,
perhaps that would
right.
make it easier, right? With the whole shame and the cultural prohibition thing, you can say, oh, it's fiction, not my family.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is what I mean, though, by the fact that I felt that in my father's passing, it had freed me, that I was not able to claim. It was a funny relationship where I wasn't even able to claim how much I was like him when he was alive, because he was so bent on seeing only my mother and her family in us, in the daughters, and the whole family was. Um, and as I've grown, I've seen so much of him in myself, including the fact that if I wrote this as fiction, it would feel so false. Um, and that the only way to tell the story, and it would almost feel unbelievable, this fact that, oh, how conveniently there's like 4 or 5 different states in one house, and how contrived that she's trying to make this house look like a microcosm of India. And so almost it feels like contrivance when you're putting what is very real textures of Indian life into fiction in those ways. It also was very scary, honestly, to answer that question, Madhuri, because we're not in a world where memoir is taken seriously. Memoir is usually seen as the thing the ladies do. They'll sit and write these tell-all books. So then to almost think of memoir as opportunity and say, well, what can I do with the form? If this is how the form has always existed, what new can I bring to the form in telling the story? And for me, that breaking apart of the form and then putting it back together became more exciting even as a writer.
Thank you. I think that's a lovely answer and also a very nice note to end on. Thank you so much, Zara. This was really, really nice.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks for having me again. And as I said at the beginning, I'm such a big fan of everything you all do.